Thank you all for joining us today for the HMSC Research Seminar. My name is Yi Chung. I'm the Academic Program Manager here at the Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport, Oregon, and I'll be your host for today's talk. This is a hybrid event with folks both on-site and online. Roseanne is here to, or Rosemary is here, Rose is here to help with our hybrid support today. Please let Rose know if you are having any technical issues so she can assist or let those of us on site know. For those of you online, we have your mics, cameras, and screen share off. If you haven't had a chance yet, sign in or sign in when you leave today on the sign up sheet outside. Again, for those of you in the room, if you're not, be sure to raise your hand if you have any questions, and we'll bring the microphone to you at the end of the presentation. We'll be recording this event, and it will be posted on the HMSC past seminar page in a few days on our link. Some quick brief announcements I wanted to make. The HMSC Lunch and Learn, which is scheduled for Wednesday, January 18th at noon in the Gwynn Library. We have Elizabeth Brazel, a postdoc scholar from the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs at the University of Washington. Elizabeth will talk about how wind stress affects the source of ocean inflow to the Salish Sea and Columbia River estuary, implications for invasive larval connectivity. Also, next week, our seminar on Thursday, January 19th, at the same time, 3:30, we will have Zoe Almeida, a postdoc scholar through the Coastal Oregon Marine Experiment Station, otherwise known as COMS, at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center. We'll talk about warmer, earlier, faster, cumulative effects of the Gulf of Alaska heat waves on the early life history of Pacific cod. And finally, the Big Blue Film Festival showcase is coming up. It showcases ocean-themed films at the confluence of marine sciences, humanities, and the arts. And that will be happening at the end of this month, January 27th, and the 28th. You can find more information on our website for all the details. And then now finally, save the date for the HMSC Marine Science Day, which will be on site this year, Saturday, April 8th. At this once-a-year open house, visitors can explore behind the scenes through our marine research labs. Scientists will have interactive exhibits and be on hand to answer questions and discuss their research. This is a free, family-friendly event, and everyone is welcome. And just a big plug, we will need lots of help to make this event a success. And it has been a while since we've had or hosted this public event here at the Marine Science Center. So today we have invited a special speaker to talk a little bit about that. We have Dr. Shawn Rowe, who's an associate professor, Oregon Sea Grant, Oregon State University. Shawn engages in research on free choice learning with Sea Grant. He has a background in applied linguistics and developmental psychology in education and holds a PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. For nearly 2 decades, Dr. Rowe has been carrying out research and teaching related to intersections of everyday knowing and thinking with the interdisciplinary teaching of science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM. With a background in applied linguistics and developmental psychology, his work is focused on family interactions in informal learning environments and how exhibits and activities support or undermine learning. In addition to this work, Dr. Rowe also works with learning in a wide variety of everyday settings, including citizen science activity, climate change decision-making, professional development of teachers, dance and musical performance, and communicating science. As an Oregon Sea Grant Marine Education Learning Specialist, Dr. Rowe engages in research on that kind of free choice learning, that the kind that people do outside classrooms and other formal education centers. Through a 5-year, $2.6 million grant from the National Science Foundation, Dr. Rowe employed cutting-edge research tools and technologies to study learning behavior at OSU's Hatfield Visitor Center. With that, would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Shawn Rowe?
Thank you, Shawn. Thank you to the small but intrepid crowd of people who are here and to the rather large crowd of people online. It's good to see so much enthusiasm, which makes me think that a lot of you probably have to present things on April 9th at the Marine Science Day, or are planning to, and are approaching that with some degree of trepidation and dread. Talking with the public about science is always filling with trepidation and dread, even to me, even though I do it quite a bit. But it need not be. And so today I promised Cinnamon and others that what I would talk about is the sort of research that we've done and the kind of recommendations that come out of that for thinking about tabletop, fair-based kinds of activities like you would set up for a Marine Science Day or any other kind of science fair kind of thing. Science fairs are increasingly of interest to groups like AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, to National Science Foundation. We've been doing them for years. Some of you remember the Da Vinci Days on campus at Hatfield. Many of you are veterans of Marine Science Day here, both in its in-person instantiation and its online version. We have talked in the past, I have, about reaching out and talking with people online in various ways. But since we're all returning to in-person Marine Science Day, we thought it'd be a good chance to talk a little bit about some of our newer information about how people learn from interacting across the table from you. So that's what we're going to do today. And I will try to keep it, I'm long-winded, but I'll try to keep it relatively brief. Let's see, here we go. I can get a small show of hands here, and maybe those of you online can have this conversation a little bit as well amongst yourselves. What do you think are the three most popular exhibits in the Visitor Center? I got two hands right here. The sand table and the two-wave energy converter kind of exhibits. The octopus does count as an exhibit, so the octopus. The touch pools. Well, that's it. You guys named them all. That actually is the list. It's pretty obvious, I think, in some ways, if you spend any time in the Visitor Center. The sand table is actually the #1 visited and most time spent with exhibit in the Visitor Center now. The Lego tsunami, let's go backwards. The Lego tsunami tank is the second in terms of number of visits and amount of time spent. The touch tank is in third place. It has always been in first, second, or third place since the first time anybody did research in the Visitor Center, which was in 1992, looking at our exhibits. So these three exhibits tend to really attract people. The octopus in fourth place, always is in fourth place when it's not staffed. Right. So when there's an octopus feeding, when there's a narration, that's a little bit different because people are a captive audience in some sense. But as people are just walking by, everybody stops at the octopus, but not everybody spends a lot of time there. Everybody stops at all these exhibits and spends a lot of time there. What is it that makes these exhibits work? Any ideas about that? They can be touched. They have a high touch component. Yeah.
Do things and change things and see what happens.
Great. So they're not only just touching, but also manipulating such that they change the setting, they change something, and then they see what happens. This is absolutely the case with the live animals, for instance. They respond, which actually is a little freaky to a lot of people at first. Yeah, each one. They're accessible across generations, also across heights, literally. With these three exhibits, which it turns out to be a very important thing. So yeah, you've absolutely got some of these things. All of these things can be engineered into a tabletop activity and more. These work, there's been a lot of research also since the early 90s. I put the first, mid-90s, I put the first paper that I know of in this area out here from from Pennsylvania, actually. The researchers identified these kind of 7 features of family-friendly exhibits, there's a lot of ways you talk about it, but these characteristics that promote engagement and therefore promote learning among family groups or multi-age groups. You can see the list. I'll just read it quickly. I will talk about these in more depth as we go through. Accessibility, that it is accessible is important. That it is multimodal, which simply means that it has different modes of communication built in. So video, text, hands-on, oral, things you can hear. That it is relevant, that the content is relevant to people in some way. That it is multi-user, that is more than one person can use it at a time, very simple. That it is multi-sided, which supports all these other things. And you'll see what I mean by that in a minute as well. That it is readable, which I will talk less about today because I have talked about that at length in other places, and I'll give you some other resources around that. And that it is multi-outcome. And this is the one that most people have the biggest problem with. So these 7 characteristics have been around in the literature, kicked around for a while. We have absolutely seen this in our own research, that these are true. What we were interested in is why, right? Not just that these are, but why. And so the research into this is that. Part of the work we did, Chung mentioned the Cyber Lab, the NSF-funded Cyber Lab. Part of the Cyber Lab was really to understand why these features support learning. What is it about these 7 things that makes them work, right? And we believe, hope you can read everything there, we believe it's because these features support higher engagement, and they shift authority, actually, to learners. They basically shift the authority for the activity over what you're doing and how you're going to do it, not to the exhibit where you're looking for information, but to yourself as somebody who has to make sense of what you see and do there. We call this protagonism, straight up from literature. This is being the author of your own learning. And it turns out that that's very powerful. These work because they do these things. They encourage collaboration among different age groups, among people who came together to the museum, among strangers, and between visitors and docents, experts, whether they're docents, volunteers, educators, or scientists. They allow for multiple users to simultaneously get in and do things, which in turn encourages collaboration. They promote eye contact. I've been doing this for, I don't know, I've been collecting video on people learning at exhibits for I don't know how many years, and I keep saying this, and exhibit developers keep ignoring it. If people can look each other in the eye while they're interacting with an exhibit, it changes the entire nature of the dynamic. Imagine yourself at an art museum where you're standing and looking at the piece of art and trying to talk to the person next to you over here while looking, versus standing at a tabletop version of the piece of art where you can see each other across and look at it together and point at it together and talk to each other. They support competing outcomes. And this one's a little tricky to get your head around. When kids and parents have different outcomes and motivations and goals, they actually learn more and better than when they all are on the same page about teaching, about what's happening in an exhibit. We see this over and over again in activities. They combine the everyday with the scientific. They do not dumb down the science. That's the absolute worst thing you can do. People see right through it. They see it as inauthentic and they leave it alone. Instead, they blend everyday ways of talking, everyday ways of observing, everyday ways of thinking with those that are more disciplinary to the sciences, vocabulary items. Ways of observing. Notice this, notice that, look at this, don't look at that. Foreground this, background that. And even problem-solving routines, like manipulation of variables that are typical of science rather than everyday life. And then finally, and this one's the scariest one, I think, for most of us, especially if we do any work related to climate change, any work related to conservation, they have to elicit visitor values and worldviews. If an exhibit is neutral, and ask visitors to approach science neutrally, it doesn't get the same kind of interest as one that is provocative, literally. And when people have opportunities to express their worldviews and to bring them their entire selves to the table, even the parts that we don't agree with or like very much, they have a better opportunity to make sense out of what they're seeing and incorporate it into their knowledge. So I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So this is kind of where I'm coming from. And as I describe how you can set these things into exhibits, I'll kind of give some maybe more specific ideas and examples. I do want to back up and say, how do we know this? Because I know some people here know a lot about how we know this. but a lot of you may not. I can't see who all is online. So if you've heard me talk about this before, just bear with me for a couple of minutes. We basically had money from NSF to instrument the entire visitor center from 2011 to 2018, which we did. We were insane. And I think, yeah, and we don't do it anymore. So it shows that we learned something, we got more sane. But the idea was that with large data sets, basically, if we collected information about every person visiting every exhibit every day over the course of time, we'd start to see patterns in interaction, patterns in behavior that was that would help us understand learning from exhibits in ways that was complementary to our very small scale research from before. To do that, we set up what we call research platforms. These were exhibits that were specifically designed using those 7 characteristics of friendly exhibits to be engaging, but to be content agnostic, if that makes sense. So that a scientist could say, I want this content and I want that content, we want this content, and we could change that variable around knowing that the platform worked. And those 5 platforms included the sand table, which is out there, the Lego tables, which are out there, the touch tanks, which is out there, the multi-touch table, which is still out there, but many of you probably don't recognize or stop and use much because it has not worked very well as a research platform. And the science on a sphere, which is no longer in existence here, but the very large projection of 3-dimensional satellite data. This also included a giant camera system, microphones, a video surveillance system in the back, and a bunch of servers and storage beyond that. This is what my desktop looked like for the 7 years. This is the 40 cameras views of the visitor center at a not very busy time, with a record over there on the far right-hand side of movement. So that's every camera. If it's green, there's something moving in the frame. If it's red, there's nothing moving there. This allowed us to start to sort through large amounts of data very quickly. It included video analytics built into the hardware that came straight from, I don't know, it's like NCIS or, something like that in our office for a while too, as well as face detection software, which was a bust. That didn't work at all, but object tracking software, which really did work, right? And it worked. This whole experiment worked. We generated a bunch of research here. We decided that it wasn't worth doing over the long haul, but instead we learned how to take the whole thing and make micro sort of versions of it. We have these mobile systems now that we take out to other museums and other places outdoors and do our research now that way. But it was all based on what we did there. And we have a huge amount of data still that has never been analyzed. And we have this new effort in Brazil, Argentina, and Colombia, where we're collecting similar data, as well as other places in the United States, to continue this work. That's how we know what we know. Okay, to the tabletops. First, let's look at what tabletop displays often look like. Apologies to anyone who might be online who put this tabletop together. I don't think any of you are here. But this was a NOAA, there's nothing wrong with it particularly. It's a NOAA exhibit at a fisheries day at the Oregon Coast Aquarium across the street. It's old now. But this is it. This is what it looks like at Marine Science Day as you walk through. You've got stuff. You've got real scientific equipment. People love that. They really do. You've got a laptop computer that has something on it. I can't tell from here what. You've got stickers, so you got giveaways. You've got data or in the form of a scientific poster that's up there, as well as a pull-up that kind of sets the stage. There's an activity that I believe is probably measuring fish or something over there with big rubber fish to measure. And then there's all the stuff that came with it underneath the table for some reason. This is what it looks like, right? Does this look inviting? Would you approach this exhibit and the person sitting in the chair at the computer to talk to them about their work? Maybe, maybe not. If there were 5 people there, would you approach the exhibit? Probably not. Right. How can we make it better? Let's use these things we just learned about. And I'm going to stick with most of the photos come from activities that we have set up either through our Communicating Ocean Science class, so public science fairs, or through Marine Science Day or similar kinds of contexts. So you'll see real tabletop exhibits as we talk through this. Multi-sided. Multi-sided exhibits allow people to work together, see each other, make that eye contact, and focus on the activity at hand. And that turns out to be really important, the shared focus of activity, as well as talk to you all at the same time. And the alternative, this one over here on the, can I get this thing to point over there, John? Yeah. Whoops. This over here is a pretty successful exhibit. I stood and watched this for a while. People are using it. And there's a lot of different things over here. But notice the presenter is standing on one side of the table, the family's standing on the other side of the table. All the materials are kind of lined up here in a particular way. The family can't talk to each other. This is a single-sided exhibit. It's a table. And our tendency in the table is for us to stand behind it and for our families to stand in front of it, which makes sense to a certain extent, but it really does cut down the amount of things that can happen there. Look at this one instead. They've literally just, set 2 or 3 tables up together. They've got these competing different kinds of surfaces, watershed surfaces, and people are pouring water in these from all 4 sides. The water is draining into a central reservoir at the bottom. The interpreter, this person and this person, are in the middle of everything, explaining it while people are doing it, having no problem. This created a huge amount of conversation and a lot of time spent as people went from one part to another part to another part. There's not a lot of waiting because people are crowded around doing it. They're coming in and out. They're coming in, they're moving. They're using the whole exhibit all at the same time. What this does is it promotes conversation, right? And, conversation may not seem like that much, but that's without being able to articulate what you're seeing and doing and point out phenomena to each other and share our attention, draw our shared attention to things. We don't do a very good job of making sense of and remembering things. So this really does set the stage from the very beginning for making sense and remembering in the context. I just came back from Hawaii with my kids and we were laughing about it because they're like, oh, yeah, when they're, 5 years from now, they won't remember any of their trip, which is probably true. So anything you can do to get people to converse about it. This is why we sit in the car on the way home from an event saying, well, what is your favorite part? What did you like the best? What did you hate? Are you going to remember that? Because you conversed about it. Multi-sided exhibits do that. What that means for you as a presenter is that you got to be not afraid to step out here in front of the table instead of behind the table. And simply doing that makes you much more accessible, makes the activity more accessible, and actually allows you to observe what's happening in a more consistent way as well. Right. Next. Okay, accessibility. I'm going to talk about accessibility in 2 ways. The first is simply physical accessibility. And we spent a lot of time in the exhibits. You're all familiar, everybody's seen our touch tanks and how they're organized at 3 different heights, really 4 different tank heights. That's specifically to allow children to access it, adults to access it without having to get down on one knee, people in wheelchairs to access it, someone with canes to be able to walk up and access it. There's a part of the touch tank that you can reach no matter what your ability level or your mobility. They're also organized in such a way that you can stand across corners and see each other. That's purposeful. They're organized in such a way that there are different systems and animals at different heights, which can cause a little bit of inaccessibility in some ways, but it doesn't seem to be a real problem. Accessible exhibits are those that can be comfortably used by both children and adults or someone with limited mobility. And these are 2 examples from my class in communication science, where you can see the first one has actually been built in this way. It's what Bill Hanshoemaker, who used to work here with us, called layered interpretation. There's some information at kid level height, and there's some information at adult level height. The information is complementary, right? It doesn't have to be the same information. In fact, it's better if it's not, because then they can share what they've learned, interacting with it with each other and build a common understanding. This has got activities below, it's got activities above, it's got signage below, it's got signage above. It's literally layered for multiple people to approach and use, right? That's one way to think about accessibility and in your tabletop. A second is in this other photo over here, you can see that everything's actually pretty high. Everything's up about this high on the table, about chest height. And so the youngest kids can't really go up there and do it. So what's happened is the facilitator has made this accessible by bringing herself down to kid level. And she's brought the materials down there with her. We're going to use the meter stick. We're going to use the measuring tools. We're going to do the activity down here where you are, while your parents or other adults or taller kids interact with the signs, interact with the other materials, read about that. And then later you can knit those two together. So we're making things accessible by simply putting them at different heights. It seems silly. It seems commonsensical. Nobody does it. When you go to a table, when you go to a fair, we used to videotape at the maker fair on campus, and every maker activity was on one of those big tables, and they're all the exact same height across the board. And so I'm always picking up the 3-year-old and holding them like this to do the activity, which means I can't do the activity. We had that problem at the sand table for a while too. Accessibility means something else too, though. Accessibility means allowing people to bring themselves to the content, as I mentioned. And that's important. And there's two things up here to kind of help walk through this idea. Hello, come on. So we've been looking at touch tanks for years and years. I've looked at more video families of touch tanks than anybody alive on Earth, I'm pretty sure. And one of the things we've seen from interactions at touch tanks and with other live animals is that families don't tend to talk about much there, except these things. And this is comparative data from Brazil and the US here. The US data is in blue, in red, the Brazil data is in blue. And you can see these are the types of talk at conservation exhibits, touch tank exhibits in particular, in Brazil and the US. And you can see the vast majority of the talk in both countries is about the animal species, about the things you're observing, right? The things you're seeing there. There's some questioning strategies that people use with each other as they ask questions of each other or docents or staff. That doesn't happen in Brazil for some reason. They talk about animals at large, not just individual species, but animals as a whole. They talk about the environment at large, about 20% of the talk in Brazil, not in the US, by the way. But note, the things that are more conceptual, ecosystems, solutions and strategies, interconnectedness, research and science, contradictions, ethics and values. People don't voluntarily sort of start talking about those things very much when they're interacting with live animals. And yet that really is the thing to talk about when you're interacting with a live animal, right? The species name I can give you, you're done. Google can tell you who the species is and something about the animals. Interacting with the animals is all about building empathy for their environment, themselves, your understanding of them, the science behind them, the world they live in. When you open the door for those conversations by your presence, right? So these conversations don't happen without a docent, a volunteer, an educator, or a scientist to make those conversations okay. Who just asks, right? What do you think about keeping animals in captivity? Do you think it's okay for us to have these animals in this tank? I got hermit crabs here. How do you think they feel about that? It's an uncomfortable question. It opens up a potentially uncomfortable space, but as soon as you do, families jump into that space and they're not there to jump on you. They start having conversations about those things that just take off. So over there's a concept map built by a family about conservation. You just ask them, what's conservation mean to you? And it turns out once you do that at the touch tanks and at other exhibits, they will start to talk about all these things, the ethics, the values, their own values, the long-term reasons for protecting the environment, for conserving things that they know about and have opinions about that are connected directly to the science and the observations that you can make about the phenomena in the world, but that they feel aren't appropriate to bring to their understanding because we have enforced the idea that that this is all neutral and objective. And yeah, sure, the name of the species is neutral and objective, but who cares at the end of the day about that, right? If you want them to care, if you want them to learn more, if you want them to be motivated more, open the conversation. They will enter that space and they will lead that conversation. And you can step back and let it happen. They will remember it, they will learn from it, and their children will become more attuned in some way to the science and to the conservation. It's a tricky spot for US scientists, I recognize that. And so I'm not trying to be sort of blithe about it, but it really does make a difference. if you want these larger conversations about the concepts and the things you care about in the science, just ask people to talk about them and they'll do it. Provide opportunity for them to talk about it. That's accessibility. Okay. Multiple outcomes. You remember when I was talking about, hey, Shawn, remember when I was talking about competing reasons for interacting with exhibits? Since we started videotaping families at exhibits, one of the coolest things to watch is how children manipulate their parents and how parents try to manipulate their children. Children are better at it than parents are, by the way. At exhibits, one of the hardest things we have as exhibit designers is giving up the notion that there's one answer that we need people to leave with in order for it to be successful. And because when you try to enforce that, when you try to create this kind of authoritative, monologic, one world, kind of idea, people see through it in some sense, and they have two options: accept it or reject it. If they accept it, they may not even believe it, right? They accept it on authority, they may not believe it, they'll probably forget it. If they reject it, that's not what you wanted. So one of the things that we've seen happens that creates these conversations, that opens the door, that leads to this longer term learning, is when you as a designer say it's okay if person A leaves with this idea and person B leaves with this idea, or if person X interacts with the exhibit this way and person Y interacts with it this way, or if they only interact with this part and not the whole thing. Once you open that door, then all kinds of things can happen. And then specifically what happens is you get these collaborations that sort of blossom in there as people think they are doing the same thing. They're interacting, and then they suddenly realize that they're each trying to do something different, and they turn and try to consolidate their point of view on it, basically, right? They start with, I'm doing this. So the way you see this with kids often, you see it in the visitor center all the time, is kids create a game out of everything, right? So I'm going to build a wall taller than you with these Legos in this sandbox. I'm going to build a wall. I'm going to knock your wall down every time you try to build it. We're going to race to get the wall built and the wave made, to see who can get it done fastest. And parents stand there and they look around and they read the signs and like, what are you supposed to be doing here? Right? And they're really looking for that supposed to be doing here. And they figure it out sooner or later. And then they turn to the kids and say, what you're supposed to be doing is this here. And then they'll put their hands in there and they'll try it themselves. Right? They start to work on, negotiate with the kids what's happening. And as they all start to negotiate what's happening, they start to use observation, use explanation, and use evidence that they see to support their own take on what's happening and why we should be doing this. And all of a sudden, they are having a more or less complex conversation about the phenomena at hand, right? So anytime you can open this up so that there are multiple outcomes, so that people are confused by what they see, or that they can express different perspectives on what they see, and then try to adjudicate those differences through more observation, the more time people will spend, the more engaged they will be with each other, with the content, and ultimately with the science. This goes back to what I just talked about with the touch tanks as well. In these multi-outcome collaborative activities, the adults tend toward talk that is based on the function that they see. What are the functions of things here? What are the forms of things here? What are these things here, right? These are this, these are that. You should recognize this, you should recognize that. Here's what you're supposed to do. I think you should do this. Those are the big conversations that families have at multi-outcome hands-on exhibits. Again, that's not the science part. That's not the interesting part to you or to me. What we want is for them to be having conversations about the phenomena, not the functioning of the exhibit. So the quicker they can get through that, and this is where you step in, the quicker you can help them get through that and straight to, what do you think is happening? With a very simple question like, why did that happen? Or what did you observe? Or, hey, try that and see what happens. Literally, if you ask somebody that, they'll try it and they will advance for you an explanation of what they saw, or at least a description of what they saw. Once you get that description and those explanations going, other people are noticing other things. They start to have these conversations. That's where they start to engage in activities that are evidence-based, that have argumentation, that involve explanation. That's scientific thinking. So if you can get those conversations geared that way through having multiple outcomes, through things that are open-ended, through observations that may be even contradictory, right, when people look at them. the better. And they don't have to leave with the right answer. It's okay if they don't leave with the right answer. You can always tell them the right answer. Okay, multimodality. Here's an exhibit, tabletop exhibit set up in the Visitors Center by a handful of graduate students. What I like about, there's a lot of things I don't like about this exhibit that I don't think work, but there's a lot of things I like about it. And specifically, I put it here because it is a great example of multimodality. So if you look at this tabletop, and they did have to harness two tables, they got the, the poster board things, they got the posters they've made and put up there, they got photographs, they have animations, they have a process animated with a historical timeline across the top. They have foraminifera down there. They have other things to observe. They have a microscope that's hooked up to a TV. They have an audio that goes along with that, narrated by one of the scientists involved. So you've literally got like 7 different modes of communication here. And they're all operating at once. And note that you can walk up and use any given one of them at a time and ignore all the rest, or you can engage with multiple ones at the same time. They're also layered, and there's some things on the tabletop, there's some things at this height, there's some things above, there's some things that you need an expert to help you with. So you need the scientist potentially to help you with the microscope if you want to look through it, but it's also what's shown on the TV is what's in the microscope, what's underneath there, what it's seeing, right? It's just hooked up like we do in a classroom so that you don't have to use the equipment to actually observe the phenomena. What our research has shown, so everybody knows this for a long time, we've known modal density increases engagement. It's because, well, what we call modal density, when you actually start to count the amount of different modes of communication in any given period of time, you actually get deeper engagement. You get more eye contact, you get more hands-on. So people having their hands together on the same phenomena, or the same object, so like an adult and a child, as opposed to either an adult or a child. You start to get people spending more time. You start to get them picking out pieces from each mode instead of digging deeply into one mode, and then spending time with each other trying to make sense of those modes and what they learned from those modes. So anything you can do, don't feel bad about having multiple ways of communicating the same idea. The problem is if each one of those modes carries a very different idea or an additional idea, you really want to zero it into your key ideas, 1 or 2 or 3 key ideas, as opposed to everything. But don't be afraid to use all of them. Here's another example of that from our work in Brazil. It's more recent data where we saw, this is a temporary exhibit put up in school gymnasiums and exhibit halls and museums around Rio de Janeiro. It consists of these kiosks. I think there's 3 of them like this, with the tree and the computer and a chest and some materials that you take out of that to go into the forest, Floresta de Sentidos, or the forest of senses, which is a biodiversity exhibit. And then you literally walk through these rooms, which are just sheets hung up on bars with this flooring put down, right? There's a off the cuff, easy to build kind of environment. I'm not suggesting you all build environments, but if you do, I would love it. This kind of deep environment, this kind of immersive experience is the ultimate in the multimodal experience. So this thing has sound coming from speakers around, right? The sounds of the bugs, the sounds of the forest, the sounds of the birds. It's got textures that you can touch and feel. It's got objects that you can open and close and explore. You get to carry a flashlight and a magnifying glass. It's like Dora the Explorer in here. You've got everything kind of built into this space, no bigger than this corner right here. And the amount of engagement among families was astounding. So kids are leading their parents through these things. They have to work. Basically, the computer says, go find this. They have to go find it in the environment and come back with some information, key it in, they get the next challenge. So these kinds of challenges that are built into the multiple modes of communication really make for an engaging and immersive experience that brings out not only a lot of conversation, but also a lot of questions for the docents that are there, which help them then lead into more complex conversations about the content, or simply engage people in doing more scientific-based observation instead of just looking around. Hey, notice this kind of thing, look for that kind of thing. What did you notice about that? But it also encourages people to spend time. literally with each other that they might not spend otherwise in these spaces, looking around and talking about what they see. Okay. But at the end of the day, and I got one more slide after this, and then we'll open up for questions and conversations. You're being there to talk, and maybe more importantly, to listen to what people say and the questions they ask you, and then literally ask questions back, is the most important thing about a tabletop activity. Just like when you give a PowerPoint like this, the PowerPoint's important, but it can always fail. You need to be able to deliver the content yourself. It's your charisma as a scientist. And you may not feel like you have a lot of charisma as a scientist, but believe me, you really do. You carry a kind of cultural authority by virtue of being associated with science as an enterprise, and a place like Hatfield Marine Science Center, which is an important community organization. And that carries with it a kind of authority that people ascribe to you, whether you feel like you have it or not, right? That doesn't mean they trust everything you say or believe everything you say, but it does bring them to the table ready to talk and hear from you and learn from you, as opposed to antagonistic about those things. Meaning making occurs in the conversations that are supported by the resources at the table, the manipulatives, the modes of communication, the signs, the video treatments, the data that you can show, whatever it is, the live animals, if you've got them. But what's really important is the conversation that comes out of those, people's interactions with those. Visitors want to talk with you and they want to hear from you. They recognize your authority, as I said, and with that comes your aha. What is your perspective on this thing? They want to know. Why do you do this? Why do you care about this? What do you know about it that I don't know, that nobody else knows? Because they recognize you have that really concrete knowledge about things that is different from what other people know about it. And then this is something I talk with teachers about a lot too. Our tendency, once people ask us about things we're interested in, is to spend a lot of time talking, right? We talk and they want to hear from us, but more importantly, you need to be able to stop, ask a question, and hear what they say. The right kind of question at the right moment can generate a conversation among the people who are listening and interacting with you themselves that may be very enlightening for you, where you can step in and say, yeah, that's right, or, well, also, have you observed that this, or, well, it's not quite right, but, and build on what they know and build on what they care about and build on what's relevant, rather than what you know and what you care about and what's relevant, which is super important, but needs to find a bridge to them. So just try asking these questions. Try stepping back and instead of talking, asking. When teachers don't do this in classrooms, guess where 2/3 of the, so if you actually videotape a classroom, 2/3 of the talk in most classrooms is the teacher talking to the students. Literally 2/3. Every second, only every third utterance comes from a child, right? It's because why? Because the teacher says, "Who knows what this is?" And somebody raises their hand and she says, "Yes, Jimmy." And Jimmy says, "That's an X." And she goes, "Yes. Who knows what this is?" Right? What's the capital of Bulgaria? Nobody? Anybody online? Maybe. Right, next. What's the capital of California? Sacramento. Okay, you guys have uttered 2 words to my 30. Literally, if I simply turn this around and ask you a question, hey, how many of you went to the beach today? Anybody? Nobody went. You all live here and nobody went to the beach today. What did you observe coming into work today? Big waves. What they look like? Bigger than normal? Yeah. We can start to have a conversation now about those waves, right? Where did all of you come to care about the ocean?
I was lucky enough to go scuba diving when I was 7 years old, but I think before that, and consequently, I'm a victim of the Jacques Cousteau universe of television.
And those of you online, you didn't get to hear that, but got the opportunity to go scuba diving when 7, but even was prepped already and primed for that by the evil Dr. Cousteau, Jacques Cousteau, who if anybody my age, that's how we learned anything about the ocean. So there you go. We just had a whole conversation. We just all learned something that we would never have known otherwise, that we can now use to have a much more deep conversation about interaction and science and the ocean and Jacques Cousteau. I'm going to stop there and we're going to open up for some questions, conversation. For those of you who are going to be presenting tabletop activities at Marine Science Day, Lindsay Carroll and I, and potentially other folks from Sea Grant, are going to be offering a workshop here at Hatfield on March 9th from 9 to 11. So it's like a 2-hour workshop. You do not have to attend the entire 2 hours. If you don't have the 2 hours, you could come for a part of it, but it will be an actual hands-on workshop where we talk some more about details like this, but we actually sit and workshop your ideas so that you leave with a plan for your tabletop activity, and down to the level of, here's the prompts I'm going to use to ask questions of people if you want. So whatever you can bring in, we're going to workshop that as much as possible so that you are ready to go. You'll have a month then to get everything in place and running. So please attend that. The place will be announced later. An email will come out from Cinnamon about it, so you'll see that. Kind of getting it on your calendar, but just so you know now, set aside the time. Questions from the audience here or online? Or comments or pushback?
Thanks, Shawn. That was fantastic. Lots of great ideas. I am going to be going to something fairly soon, a career fair, and talk a little bit about marine science and careers in marine science. Probably I'll focus on biological side of things since that's where my strengths are. But some of the things that are suggested may not be within my capacity to change. I mean, I like the idea of being, having multiple around, right, sort of thing. And I can certainly move. I don't have to sit behind a table or that sort of stuff. But there may be limitations as well. And I'm sure that, I would love to attend the workshop and get some ideas, but, but in general, people sometimes have limitations on what they're able to do and how they're able to set things up. Yep. And I guess, I'd like to hear you speak about that. I'm guessing that you do what you can, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of times when we go into, well, so I had it recently, we were going to do a water-based activity with a bunch of teachers. This cup and card activity where you give people playing cards and martini glasses or beer glasses and see if they can make the card stick to the glass. Anybody ever done that? Oh, it's a cool activity, but it spills a lot of water. And the problem is you walk into some places, then you walk into a place like this, and like no water, right? No water. Everybody's gonna be facing you. It's like, what do you do, right? How? What's my plan B? So in that case, plan B is to literally have people talk about what they think would happen and demonstrate it up here. But the problem with that is demonstrations are great. People love demonstrations. People love TED Talks. It's the least powerful way to learn anything, but people love it. So if you've got a good demonstration, or if you've got anything that you can show, but a challenge you can give to people to make sense of it from out there, that starts to do these other things. Because what it does is it opens up the potential outcomes for one thing, right? So people can talk about this, or you can ask people to provide ideas about what you can try, right? I want to show you something, but I want you to tell me what I should try next. And it's a little bit like being hey, Houdini. You're kind of walking out on stage and being a little vulnerable because it might not work, but basically what's going to work and what's not with your stuff. So that's one way to do it. But the key, I think, is to get people talking in the audience about what they think is going to happen or what they think they're going to observe. And then once you do something or say something, then turning it back to them and asking them to talk about what they observed, either with each other, because a lot of times they don't want to tell you, right, with each other a little bit, and then maybe share it out with everybody else. or something like that. So that's, at the very least, the core thing is getting people to converse with each other, not just hear from you. And it's a little tricky in some situations, but that's key. The other thing that I think works well is if you've got anything that you can hand people in small groups so that they have to do it together, right? And so there was a photo up here of some of our partners in crime at Hatfield Marine Science Center over here. And we've literally given them, this is an activity where I give people 2 beakers. One's got salt water in it, one's got fresh water in it. I give you 2 pieces of ice and I ask you the question, is the ice going to melt faster in the salt water or fresh water? Right? And people get the answer wrong all the time. So I'm putting you on the spot. The key is not in the answer, but in the observations that people make with each other as they run through the experiment themselves. And so any kind of small, completely contained experiment that you can do with 1, 2 people, 4 people, 5 people at a table, and especially if you're walking into a classroom context, there's always going to be the teacher there who you can harness into helping. There may be an aide who you can harness into helping, and literally asking them to help and not being afraid to sort of bring them in, not as experts, but as facilitators, I think can help too. So, taking advantage of the setup of the classroom. Other questions?
Any more questions in person? Online?
You have one comment from Emily Payne at the OSU Foundation, and I'm hoping she'll post she did a little private message to me because she wasn't quite sure. But she is here to help with things like this, and she said she specifically assigned private foundation grants, and if people might be interested in that. So I'm hoping she's just going to put that message into the chat. And Shawn, I also encouraged her to contact you directly. So.
Great. Let me put my contact info back up there at the end.
Shawn, I had a question.
Yes.
So you mentioned about this workshop that's happening from 9 to 11 here at the Marine Science Center. One, where in the Marine Science Center will it be held?
Don't we have a space yet, do we?
Okay.
TBD.
Okay, save the date. And then the other is like, what are some of the things that you would cover? Maybe some highlights of what you would cover in the workshop.
Yeah, I think we'll work specifically on some of the details about this. So for instance, one of the things I didn't talk about here is the readability piece. So if you're going to have text, you're going to have signs, they need to be readable and they need to be accessible. And we have a lot through our research and through our eye tracking work and all these other things. We have a lot of recommendations about everything from font size to types of image to colors that you can use on graphs and tables and false color satellite images. How to make data and what you say about that data about your work maximally accessible. So we'll actually spend some time on that, on readability for your signs and your text. We would also spend some time on the more detailed kind of setup. What really makes a hands-on activity work, and maybe even and workshop people's ideas. I got this kind of thing. I'd like to do this kind of thing with it. Can you help me come up with some ideas for how to make that maximally effective? Right. So what are the recommendations from the research around that? We will probably also delve a little bit into honing your message from multiple ideas down to one key idea with several supporting ideas. So a little bit of that kind of work as well.
So I have a question from Karina. Shawn, considering immersive environments, what do we know about learning from VR environments? I love that one.
Thanks. So my last talk over here was in conjunction with several other colleagues who have been working on VR, virtual reality, I guess what we call cross reality in general. So cross reality environments. And one of the things that we are learning from cross reality environments and that we are hoping to do some more research on in the Visitor Center in the next several years is that a lot of the things that apply to learning in this environment apply in the virtual environment or in cross environments where you have elements of both. So conversation is still the driver of meaning making in the virtual environment. There is a wow factor, there's a novelty factor that primes people for learning more when they're in these immersive environments. There is an immediacy to things like dinosaurs or whales or things that you just don't have standing here in this room that we can put into the environment that creates novelty, creates immediacy, and creates a level of authenticity that are hard to get outside of visiting places and doing things in the world. But those things wear off very quickly if there's not the deeper meaning-making conversation happening. And so you still benefit heavily from guided, expert-led activity inside the virtual environment, right? So virtual environments create immersion in a way that we just don't do otherwise. For those of you who've used them or have seen them or experienced them, they can be super powerful hooks into content and ideas and ways of thinking. But you still need to do that work on the other end of it to, oh, notice this. Oh, there's a Tyrannosaurus Rex running by. That's interesting. Notice this about how he runs. And notice that about the environment. Notice that about what matters here. Because people don't know what matters in the virtual environment any more than they know what matters in this environment, unless they're focused and told and guided. Excellent question, Karina. Thank you.
I just had one more follow-up question, Shawn. So, you talked a little bit about the how things are set up for tabling, in particular in light of the Marine Science Day that's coming up. But I think of some of the folks who are online and some of the folks here who attend conferences and meetings, large scientific conferences and meetings. And typically they have a big space for tabling, where they're trying to engage, whether it be other researchers, companies, students, things like that. The tabling that you explained is really helpful as far as engagement. I'm wondering if you have any comments on how you sustain past that point of tabling where you're engaging with them and then you got them hooked. Are there other things that you are aware of as far as sustaining that conversation beyond that moment of tabling?
Yeah, so yes. And I think so at big conferences, you see this in the exhibitor hall, right? Every time we go to a conference, we come back with a giant bag of swag for our kids, right? Pins and everything from everybody. And the goal of that is to keep the conversation going, which doesn't work because you bring it home and you give it to your lab mates or to your family. So that it doesn't really do it. What I've seen recently, though, is people using, and it gets to Karina's question too, using augmented reality, not virtual reality. So it's kind of lower key hyper reality built into their posters. So you got a poster, you got something, you have a giveaway, whatever it is, that's got a QR code. It doesn't have to be a QR code. It can be a photo that says, take a picture of me, and it hyperlinks to something. It could be your website. It could be a video about your work, a YouTube shot, a video about somebody else's work that you're really interested in with some commentary or gloss from you about it. It could be just a more in-depth, it could be your faculty website. I mean, if you're trying to bring students to your lab, for instance. But these things that as people hold up their device, they see, not in the same way that you take a picture of the QR code, leave, and then forget to look it up later, but that actually appears right there in between me and you on my tablet or my laptop or my phone while we're talking, can really create this connection, right? That begins to persist, because that goes with people and they remember it and they want to show it to other folks and that kind of thing. So I think that's important. More important in a sense than the physical carry away thing is the link, literally, that you make there that can be carried away and revisited. So I think anything that you can do like that creates these hyperlinks from people's devices to your table, to what you represent, your lab, your university, whatever it is that's going on there. The other thing I think is I noticed at the last conference I was at where there were a lot of people at the table, it was because they had literally just flipped it around. They'd moved their table back and they had put the chairs in front of it and they had made a place where people could literally sit down, for a few minutes and have a conversation with each other or with you. And they didn't give, people were stopping and using their phones, putting their stuff down so they get their phone out and check it. They didn't care. That's great. It brings people to the table. People are interacting. They're doing everyday things. Then they're also talking with you while they're there. So I think anything that can create these links, whether they're human links or virtual links that persist.
Yeah, that just confirms in the past couple of meetings and conferences, I've seen a huge rise in QR codes, which stands for quick response. And with everyone using cell phones, folks are just going by, making that connection, and then using that QR code to link to each other.
Yep.
And then have those follow-up conversations.
Anything that people can share on their social media.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I believe we're out of time here, so I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, this presentation is recorded and will be up on our YouTube and our past seminar page. Thanks again, and everyone, please join me in thanking Shawn Rowe for coming and giving us a great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you all.
And don't forget to sign on the way out or grab a cookie.